Calcutta, in the days leading up to it, had been working itself into a frenzy.
Somehow blew up only in Bengal.
It's linked to the Bengal famine. If you read the articles from the morning of that day, it is all to do with, is another Bengal famine about to break out? There is no doubt that he incited much of what happened.
Can you give us a little bit of a political background to why had Jinnah announced Direct Action Day in the first place?
Sure. So the fight over the Pakistan demand is one that had been there for about 6 years at this point. And it's first made actually in response to an earlier partition that we often forget about, which is the separation of Burma. That was actually the first of many partitions that the Raj has seen. Initially, when Jinnah makes his demand for Pakistan, it's not quite clear what he's demanding. Is he demanding a separate, a federation of which Pakistan and India are different parts, or is he demanding an entirely new nation state? But all of these different plans fall apart in mid-1946 at what's known as the Cabinet Mission Plan, where negotiations with Gandhi and Nehru in the Congress finally fall apart. And Jinnah announces that he has no hope anymore of working for a united India, no hope anymore of some sort of federal solution to the Congress and Muslim League's disagreements, and that he will, and that the Muslim League cadres across India actually need to go into the streets and do a show of support for the idea of Pakistan, to show both the Brits and the Indian National Congress quite how large this demand support has.
All right. And this was for all of India, right? The call for Direct Action Day. But it somehow blew up only in Bengal, on the streets of Calcutta, where it began. So why was that the case? What happened in Bengal?
So this is exactly the question. And I think that a lot of people assume that when Jinnah made the announcement for Direct Action Day, it was a demand for violence everywhere, because Direct Action Day would lead to the first partition massacres. And thus, the question of who started the violence is one which is fraught with immense tension. Whoever starts the violence is in a sense, responsible for all of the partition violence that follows from Direct Action Day. What new research, I think particularly from people like Janam Mukherjee and Joya Chatterjee, has shown is that it's actually, rather interestingly, it's a disagreement between Jinnah and the local Muslim League cadre on the ground, Suhrawardi, that leads to the difference in what happens in Bengal. Suhrawardi had been under the assumption that when Jinnah at the Lahore resolution called for independent Muslim states, plural, he'd been under the assumption that East and West Pakistan might essentially become different countries. He didn't think that, so he was thinking that by leading Bengal into the Pakistan demand, that he would be getting essentially a kind of proto-Bangladesh, a separate country that wouldn't necessarily be under the rule of Karachi. And shortly before Direct Action Day happens, Jinnah rescinds this idea and says, no, that was a printing error. Actually, I'm after an independent Muslim state, singular. And this disagreement, Suhrawardi decides to push for a much vaster scale of demonstrations on Direct Action Day, much more militarized than exists elsewhere in the country, so as to show not just the Congress, but also to show Jinnah his own power. And I think that this is the crucial thing. He is trying to not only show Gandhi and Nehru, he is also trying to show off Jinnah. And there is this tension here between different Muslim League ideals.
Okay, that's interesting. In your book, you mentioned quite a lot of details about Suhrawardi, the personality as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what was he like?
Sure. So he's a rather fascinating figure. He is this he's somewhat anglicized. He's kind of constantly seen in the company of socialites and drinking a lot. He's not seen as particularly communal, but he is sort of renowned as a bit of a gunda. He's got this nickname, the King of the Gundas of Kolkata.
Mm.
um
Okay.
and but he's not seen as particularly communal, and he's seen as a rather brilliant lawyer, a rather brilliant politician, very clever, very sly, but with all sorts of links to the underworld in a sense. And that's
Okay.
and that's the kind of image that really comes across in the sources that I've read, at least.
So would you say that, the way Sohrawardi that also determined the kind of violence that erupted on the streets of Calcutta on 16th August?
So it's a question of like huge importance, and one which again is difficult to know precisely what happened. He clearly, on Direct Action Gay, gives a very kind of insightful comments, but he does not actively call for violence. But he tells the people of Kolkata to kind of go and show everyone basically the power of the Muslim League, essentially. And what you get in the wake of his speech is a bit like what you get in the US after Trump made that announcement, but after Biden won the election. Did he or did he not send people and incite people to go and storm the White House? It's that kind of question. He seems to have hinted towards it and not been opposed to it, but he chose
Mm.
his words carefully so that it's very difficult to actually indict him. Now, what
Okay.
seems to have happened with the Direct Action Day violence is that Kolkata, in the days leading up to it, had been working itself into a frenzy. You have Muslim League National Guard cadres arming themselves. You have members of the RSS arming themselves. You have Congress League cadres arming themselves. And you have everyday people worried that violence is about to break out between these very, Muslim nationalists, Hindu nationalists, etc. You have communists arming themselves, and you have everyday people arming themselves with lathis when they're going out, just in case. What seems to have happened is that it's linked to the Bengal famine, because the first violence recorded that day is actually people breaking into shops to steal food. If you read the articles from the morning of that day, it is all to do with, is another Bengal famine about to break out? There's been a crop failure, and they've only just recovered just 3 years earlier. They're still
Mm.
recovering from the previous Bengal famine. And so the first violence seems to be people attacking looters who are trying to loot food, etc.
Oh.
But in this tensest of environments, suddenly everyone starts attacking each other. Suddenly, all of these groups, all of the Muslim League National Guards, Congress cadres, communists, RSS, all of them, it's unclear the order of events. And on the day, the police managed to put down the violence. Like it lasts a couple of hours, and the police sort of it's the army is almost sent in, but then it's not, because they think that they can handle it. And that night there's heavy rain and everyone goes to bed thinking that it's over. What happens then is very unclear, but overnight there's mass murder. And suddenly, this violence that's been breaking out across the city in the day, but in bits and pieces, suddenly turns into full on ethnic cleansing. With often, there was one interviewee recorded by, I think it's Anshul Malhotra, which was, I
Mm.
think it was a Hindu who was saved by their Muslim neighbors, and they were kept in the attic by their Muslim neighbors. And then one day, I think it's on day number 3, the Muslim neighbors go out and kill a Hindu in the street. And the Hindu who's living in the attic is shocked and says, "What about, why are you saving me?" And he's like, "Oh, we know you, so it's different." And so there's all these moments of abject horror that suddenly, and full on kind of ethnic cleansing that suddenly sweeps into the streets of Kolkata. So, and what happens in the wake of Direct Action Day is just as important, because news has become so polarized, just as in the 21st century. News has become so polarized that in the northwest frontier and in Sindh and in Noakhali, you will have Muslims hearing that only Muslims were killed. Whereas in UP and Bihar, you have Hindus hearing about the massacre of Hindus, but not hearing about the massacre of Muslims. And so, as this polarized news spreads across the country, there's retaliatory violence directed at opposite religious communities. And so, in the wake of Direct Action Day, both Hindus and Muslims claim to be the most targeted. And if you go to Pakistan or Bangladesh today, their version of Direct Action Day is always about the massacre of Muslims rather than the massacre of Hindus incited by Suhrawardi. Whereas I think
Mm.
it's a mix of all of the above. I think that Suhrawardi, there is no doubt that he incited much of what happened. At the same time, I think that there is no doubt that the first violence that emerged that day was actually far more to do with, the Bengal famine in some sense.
Mm.
It was people breaking into shops. And in this most energized and terrifying of moments when everyone in the streets was armed, afraid of what was about to happen, suddenly these moments, these small kerfuffles, spiraled in a way that no one could have possibly foreseen.
Very, very interesting. And a lot of this, we haven't really heard about or read before. So I'm very glad that you've brought so much of information uh, out for us. How was normalcy achieved finally? Do we know?
Happens gradually. It it lasts for sort of weeks, and I think when Margaret Book White arrives in the streets of Kolkata a week later, she describes, this is the Raja's former capital, just a few decades earlier. She describes the street of Kolkata as looking like Buchenwald, one of the concentration camps that she had visited in Germany weeks earlier. This is the scale of violence that had occurred. What is extraordinary is that Bengal saw almost more violence in 1946 than elsewhere. But what really changes actually is Gandhi shows up and begins leading those famous marches, bringing Hindus and Muslims together. So I think it's Mujibur Rahman, later the founder of Bangladesh, who writes about, at the moment of greatest suspicion about neighbors, suddenly joining in these peace marches and suddenly, marching together with Hindus for peace. And I think it's Mountbatten writes that whereas in Punjab they have 30,000 officers and there's mass violence. In Bengal, he just has Gandhi and everything has calmed down. I think Gandhi for the previous decade had been getting ever more erratic. He'd been doing all sorts of, strange, all of those experiments we hear about, sleeping naked next to his niece, etc. And he had
Mm. Mm.
lost his shine to a
Mm.
great extent. Like, he didn't
Absolutely.
have the respect that he had a
Mm.
decade earlier.
Mm.
And I think that really changes when this violence starts out, and once he starts doing these peace marches, it's the kind of great finale, and he re-emerges as this great leader that the sheen had begun to wear off in some extent just
Okay.
beforehand. And I
Oh,
think that it's rather fascinating that I think during Independence Day he refuses to celebrate because he's fasting in Kolkata to try and keep again peace going in Bengal.
okay. Okay. Then again, very interesting. And lastly, how would you say what is the significance of the Direct Action Day and the violence that erupts on in Bengal? How does that shape the history of Bengal just in the next few months or then in the next 1 year? What significance does it have?
It's but until Direct Action Day, I don't think that partition in the way that happened was a foregone conclusion, or even if it happened, it would have been accompanied by the death toll that it did. It's the first moment of partition violence, and virtually every other piece of partition violence happens in response to it. The next one that occurs directly afterwards is the Noakhali massacres.
Mm.
And this
Mm.
much more than Direct Action Day is very clearly local politicians who are taking advantage of the situation and essentially just murdering their Hindu constituencies, and often kind of, mass forced conversion to Islam, accompanied alongside these mass killings. And here we see, I think it's in Noakhali, that we first see the sort of genocidal violence that will months later be seen all across Punjab. That Punjab really gets going in early 47. It's actually quite peaceful at this time.
Okay, okay.
And But I think that Sarojini Naidu puts it best. Sarojini Naidu, who is arguably the greatest female nationalist in the independence
Mm,
movement, and then the most important and always at the center of events. She had been in the 20s very close to Jinnah. In fact, she'd probably been one of Jinnah's closest friends. She wrote a book about Jinnah called The Greatest Ambassador of Hindu-Muslim Unity. And yet, in the wake of
mm,
this, Direct Action Day, she describes him as like Lucifer, an angel who once promised to bring us to heaven, but who has now fallen into the depths of hell. And she, so there is no talking between the leaders
mm,
of the Muslim League and the Congress after this. They, despite actually quite close relationships a decade earlier, it's the point of no return. And from this point, suddenly partition somewhat becomes inevitable. Suddenly, the violence that's sweeping across the country becomes inevitable. Of course, Mountbatten will later make it worse by shifting the dates of partition, etc., and
mm,
speeding
mm,
everything up so that there's
mm,
even more chaos. But I think that it's if you went 2 days before, 2 weeks before Direct Action Day, um, the events of 1947 were not inevitable. 2 weeks after Direct Action Day, I would argue that it had gone past the point of no return, and that it was inevitable by this point that the country would break up, and that you would see the death toll that
mm.
you did.
Okay. All right, Sam, that was a very, very enlightening, incredibly enriching conversation. Thank you so much for all the information that you've given us on this topic.